Welcome back to week 9, and this is the third element related to group work, although this element can be utilized for individual student work, but the way that I've modeled it in class has been primarily based on collaborative group learning, so I decided to go ahead and group it with this one. So number 23 of Marzano's Becoming a Reflective Teacher Elements, what do I typically do to provide resources and guidance? How's that related to group learning? Well, let's find out. The teacher acts as a resource provider and guide as students engage in cognitively complex tasks. Last 3 words, cognitively complex tasks. I would certainly say that the development of a group lesson plan, a unit plan, writing an IEP, and developing a mock case conference, those qualify as cognitively complex tasks. So how does the teacher, how have you seen me actually providing resources and guidance throughout those experiences? And how can you imitate the parts that you think were effective and that Marzano suggests are effective when you're actually working with groups in the classroom? Or even individuals, because I know some of you are in settings where you only work with 1 to 2 students at a time. So how can you modify these to work with an individual? Teacher evidence. The teacher's going to ask students to provide support for their claims. I asked you to provide supports for your claims during the math group lesson plan testing activity where I pressured you to say, okay, I'm the administrator in the classroom and you now have to support for me why you're doing what you're doing in there and how everything is connected. Next, the teacher asks students to examine their claims for errors in reasoning. So I certainly question you when you went one direction with something in your math lesson plan and said, well, then how does that work? How would you apply that? Maybe it's all in the facial expression. Anytime I look like this at you, then that definitely means that I'm challenging your errors in reasoning. So the teacher makes himself or herself available to students who need guidance or resources by doing the following. Circulating around the room. How many of you does that get on the nerves of when I'm wandering around and you feel like I get so close and I'm kind of listening that you feel like you can't think anymore? Because I certainly have reacted that way to people doing that. But it also encourages me or challenges me to rise to their expectations. So I definitely try to circulate around the room. And I know that I did that differently in class this week where I used Google Docs to figuratively circle around the room and circulate around the room by circulating throughout your lesson plans and giving you feedback based on that content. So technology is pretty nice, and I like that, but I definitely like to be near to the students to be able to really hear all of your conversations and connect that with what you're doing. But both methods are methods of providing resources and guidance by circulating and providing easy access to the teacher somehow. So using the chat feature that I used in Tuesday or in the Thursday class, and then Wednesday we basically were kind of talking to one another across the room. But all of that works. Access and circulating around the room. So the teacher interacts with students during the class to determine their needs for hypothesis generating and testing tasks. So fancy words for saying, again, when I ask you questions and say, well, tell me more about that. Tell me why you did that. Well, what would happen if you did this? And where I put sort of that cognitive pressure on you to make you question why you're saying and doing what you're saying and doing. Those are when you are hypothesis generating and testing a student. So it's useful to make them engage further in cognitively complex tasks. The teacher volunteers resources and guidance as needed by the entire class, groups of students, or individual students. I did bring back to you after Tuesday's class, I brought to the Wednesday class and Thursday class the Indiana UDDI website because I listened to what you said and recognized where the gaps were and recognized that you needed more examples to be able to engage with this task without frustration. So I will continue to do that and would encourage you to do the same with your students. Don't think that just because you plan that lesson plan that day and you started to present it, that you don't need to go back for the next day, even if it was a 3-day plan, that you don't need to go back and modify something for the following day. So student evidence. Students will provide grounds for their comments or their decisions. They'll back them up and they'll say, well, we chose this because of this. This is what we had to work with, so this is why we made this decision. So students that have been through this process with a teacher guiding that engagement with those cognitively complex tasks, students will know how to respond. And can you imagine when you're out in the real world and you are pressed for a reason for why you chose to do something? If you've practiced this, it will be much easier when it's like maybe a stressful situation and you're having to defend your choices. So students can find and correct their errors or limitations in their claims. So students begin to grow in these cognitively complex tasks in a way that allows them to not have to have someone else being the presser, the tester, but they start to test themselves. So it becomes sort of like that think aloud process, but it's internalized, and metacognitively, they're able to say, gosh, have I tried this out? Does this make sense? Let me see if this was the best decision. And they test themselves. Students will seek out the teacher for advice and guidance regarding this hypothesis generation and testing process. So I think when you're chatting with me or when you call me over to say, hey, what about this? Does this work? Or look at this. Did this make sense to you, Anna, Mrs. Epperly, whatever you call me at this point, which, whatever works. Someday I'll have my doctorate and I'll officially be Dr. Epperly. Won't that be exciting for us all? But you actually are seeking out the teacher in the room because the teacher is a source of support and guidance, and you want to have that pressure placed upon you as a student because you don't want to not do things the best way possible. So when asked, the students can explain how the teacher actually provides assistance and guidance by doing the things that I'm talking about. So again, I hope that you see evidence of this in me as a teacher if someone were to ask you, well, how does she make you think more deeply about what you're doing? Even when it's frustrating, how do I do that? Because I don't want it to just be surface learning. I want you to carry this forward and be able to test yourself someday. There are just a couple more examples that they give. They actually give a couple really complex ones about examining claims for errors and statistics and things. We're not going to address those. I just want you to realize some of the really basic, cheap, and easy options you have for sort of being that tester and helping students engage in the cognitively complex tasks. You might sort of develop your own little interview profile, kind of like I did with the administrator role that I played. And I asked you like 3 questions as part of the profile. Please, let me know what standards you're working with and what objectives you're using to assess those standards, and then what your assessment activities are that you're utilizing to ensure that the objectives are met for the standards that you selected. So that was sort of my interview, and I did go around the room testing you before I allowed you to get up in front of your peers and try that out. So that's one example they suggest. Obviously, circulating around the room, you can't just sit at your desk and know what students are thinking. And I gain more information from you guys just wandering around the room and hearing what you're saying. I gain almost more from that than I do from your final products, because I get to hear how each individual is contributing to the discussions and what misconceptions are present. Expressions and gestures. I did not plan to use my hands so much in these videos. It just happens to be where I happen to have the camera pointed. But some of the things that you do that are just natural to you are actually very meaningful to students, and they show your engagement with them as learners. And they specifically mention things that, again, I didn't even realize I was doing, but I feel like, I guess when people do this for me as a learner, that it helps me. But when you kneel by a student's desk, when you use the hand gestures when you're explaining something, which clearly today I can't stop doing, you make eye contact with the student. That is so necessary. You have to attend to them when you're speaking to them. And then nodding while a student is explaining his or her need. Even if you're a new teacher and it's hard to think about so much at once, you kind of have to force yourself to still be a great listener when they're explaining what's going on, or otherwise you might actually close off an avenue for communication that you can't open back up again because they feel like you weren't listening to them. And then you need to be able to think on your feet and ask questions to gain a clear understanding of what the student's learning level is or misunderstanding is. So all of those little teeny discrete skills and tricks that you need to have, they all have to do with how you're going to interact with groups and individuals to help them engage in these cognitively complex tasks. The last two talk about collecting assessment information. So you make sure that you are always looking at their progress as they're moving through a task. So you are formatively assessing them, even if it wasn't a formal formative assessment. So you're just looking at the products of student work over time to see if there's some errors that are pervasive that you need to address with some additional instruction. And then you give feedback to students as you're seeing those different parts sort of teased out in their work and in all of the assessment profiles that you're developing for your class. So you praise them when they perform well in terms of their task performance or correct or incorrect answers, and levels of effort. Just make sure that you're not just praising for all the A's or just telling everyone they do a good job all the time. If you want them to engage in cognitively complex tasks, you have to help them find the errors in their reasoning, notice when they're doing things correctly, and then reinforce the appropriate behaviors just like you would if it were a social skill or just a simple classroom management related behavior. So I know this one went over 10 minutes, but I figure, it's been a couple weeks. We'll just go with it, and we'll just all accept that I can't not talk, any less than 10 minutes, I guess, double negatives. But anyway, I hope y'all have a great week, and I hope that anybody that made it to the end of this recognizes that we didn't have any interruptions this week. Impressive. You know why? Because my husband's out of town now, and my kids are at my mom's. So let that be our little secret to those of you that actually watched all 3 videos. Thank you. Bye-bye.